Our next speaker is going to launch us into wolf and other predator programs in Wisconsin. And his name is Brad Cooley, and I'll just bring him right on. Thank you, Brad.
Thank you, Otto. Good morning. Thanks for being here. I mean, such a beautiful Saturday, and you guys are spending it with us. And thanks for allowing me to come and talk about the departments or the states, basically our wolf and bear management programs. Dave McFarland was originally on the agenda to talk about state management of wolves and bears. Dave couldn't make it, so I'll be providing his talk, or his overview of management actions the state's taking, but then I'll also dive into our compensation and damage programs for those species as well. I've been with the DNR since 2001. I started out within our big game program, focusing primarily on deer and bear. And then in 2007, I transitioned to our wildlife damage program, where I administer all aspects of the state's nuisance and urban and agricultural damage programs with wildlife. So been doing that, like I said, since 2007. So for the past 10 years, wildlife damage has been my primary focus. So today I'll get into the bear and wolf management programs, the bear population and management. This is a statewide map showing the primary range and bear distribution. As you, no surprise there, the northern third of the state, abundant and common bear sightings there. As you go kind of southwest, bear sightings are becoming more frequent down there. Bears are expanding their range southward. Southeast, not as many sightings there, and particularly down in the lower southeast corner of the state, very few, if any, bear sightings there. But the take-home message there is the bear population is doing very well, and they're expanding their range southward. There's primarily three different things that we do to monitor the bear population. One is the annual bear harvest. We do collect teeth from every bear, or attempt to collect teeth from every bear, and that gives us age data. Tells us how old the bears are that are being harvested, and obviously if there's a shift in that age, it's an indicator of whether or not that population, whether or not it's aging or people are harvesting younger bear. So it gives us a index to look at as far as how the bear population is doing. The other thing that is we do is the annual bear bait station survey. So they're 25-mile transects where we place a meat bait. We hang meat approximately 7 feet in trees every half mile. And then we come back after a week and check those baits to see if they've been hit by a bear. Those baits sit out there for a week. And again, that gives us another index or a trend line and how that bear population is doing. The other one is a tetracycline recapture or mark recapture study. Basically for that study, the first year we did it was in 2006. A lot of cooperation from that study with UW and then also the Wisconsin Bear Hunters Association. They help out immensely with that because it's such a labor-intensive monitoring method. But basically, tetracycline baits are placed out on the landscape. For those of you that are aware of tetracycline, what it does is it creates a marker in the bone structure. So basically it creates a ring in the bone structure of the bear. And then as bears are harvested, we require hunters to submit a rib sample to us so we can look for that marker, and then it's used to, the proportion of marked versus unmarked bear are used to do a reconstruction model and, give us an estimate. So 2006 that was done, 2011 that was done. This year it was supposed to be done again here in 2016, but there's some new FDA restrictions on broad-scale use of antibiotics. Obviously, there's some concerns with creating immunities to antibiotics, so tetracycline can no longer be used, so we're exploring other options. My understanding is Rotamine B is potentially an alternative that we'll be looking at for continuing this type of estimation method. And it does basically the same thing, from my understanding, is it creates a marker in the bone structure of the animal that we can use to see whether or not it ingested the bait. So this is an example of the bear bait transect. So 18 transects across the northern part of the state in zones A, B, and D. We currently have 7 transects in zone C that we run. And again, these are or 25-mile transects where baits are placed every half mile. This is a picture of kind of what it looks like. This is from Michigan DNR. They have a little bit different process, but this is a bear that, you know, obviously has, you know, is ingesting that bait. Some of the things we look for to make sure it was a bear is, you know, markings. These baits are all placed in soft trees, soft bark trees, so you can, you know, more likelihood of get some type of markings from the animal. Bear, this one's not too hard to tell. You know, you can see a pretty good muddy paw print of a bear there on the tree. Other indications would be scratch marks. We do have a gauge that we used that looks at the spacing of those claw marks to verify if it was a bear or not. But nonetheless, all these techniques, this bear bait transect is used every year to create that index and tell us how well that bear population is doing each year. This is just a snapshot of Vilas and Oneida County there of our tetracycline study. So the idea there is that we place small wooden boxes with a bait inside with the tetracycline, you know, every 3 miles within the township there. So again, you dot the landscape, and it's pretty incredible effort. This is what it looks like across the northern part of the state there. So each one of those boxes or squares there is where a tetracycline bait was placed out there. The red color there was the baits that were hit by bear, or that we know were hit by bear. So a pretty huge effort going out across the northern part of the state there, you know, to show us exactly where bear are. And so it's the same concept. We have a little wood box with some bait and a bear, a tetracycline tablet in that box, and the bear obviously finds that bait, breaks it open, and consumes that tetracycline. And then, you know, then the hunter harvested bear, we collect rib tissues from those bear, and then we use it to reconstruct the population. So this is the trend line of the statewide bear population. As you can see, we have a very healthy population across the state. It is increasing. Right now, our current estimate of bear, the bear population is 28,650. So, you know, pretty good population. And like I said, that population seems to be expanding their range southward and certainly occupying a lot more of particularly the southwest part of the state. So, of course, with you know, with the growing population, you also need to manage that population. We primarily manage a lot of our wildlife species through hunting or trapping. Bear, it's hunting. In the state here, we do allow the use of bait and the use of hunting with hound dogs in the northern part of the state. So, you know, we've tried to or we use hunting as a method to control the bear population. You can see there our harvest along with the population has also increased as the population's increased. One thing to note there, you see the absence of any information for 1985. 1985, the state actually closed bear hunting. At that point, the population was right around 4,500 animals, and at that point, the state felt, you know, we need to close the hunting season, implement more of a structured harvest. Prior to that, bear could be harvested during the deer hunting season with, I think, a small game and even a gun deer hunting license. So license restrictions were pretty loose. And so 1985 is when we had kind of the current season structure or permit system that was implemented there. And as you can see, with those protections, with limited quotas, you know, the bear population has really done well since that point. The state is broken into 4 zones there, as you can see: A, B, C, and D. A and D at one point in time were a contiguous unit, and even D was actually a subzone of Zone A at one point, but nonetheless it is now its own zone. We're here in Washburn County, of course, and that's Bear Management Zone D. But these are the zones that we use for setting our bear quotas and season structures every year, our harvest structures every year. The permit levels, you know, have gone up. You know, as that bear population's increased, we've recognized the need to harvest additional bear. So our permit levels and quotas have also increased. 2016, this will be another record year with permit levels out there. You know, we're expected to issue approximately 11,520 bear permits this year. So, you know, certainly a lot of pressure on that bear population to, keep numbers as best we can. That's both socially and biologically acceptable to the public. Applicants, Wisconsin is, we're kind of a destination state for bear hunting. Our success rates here in Wisconsin for hunting are unmatched by any other state. Even in Zone C, where our success rate is, probably down in the upper 20%. That's higher than a lot of states have. And then you get in the northern part of the bear range where you're looking at zones A, B, and D. Our success rates are 60% or higher, which are just incredible for bear hunting. So Wisconsin's got a lot of interest, from non-residents and even within the state for hunting. Our application levels have increased, pretty steadily. Right now we're around 110,000 applicants is what we receive each year. So a huge interest in hunting bear in Wisconsin. I guess before I get to that, that interest in bear hunting has led to long wait times for permits. Our wait times for permits range anywhere from 1 year all the way up to 9 years. So, in Zone C right now, the southern part of the state, maybe every year, but for sure every other year, you could likely expect a permit in Zone C. You get up to Zone B in the northeast part of the state, those wait times are as long as 9 or 10 years for a permit. So that interest is certainly nice, but it's definitely led to some long wait times. And historically in the state, hunters have preferred kind of a high quality, high success hunt over a lot of opportunity. So we haven't made any changes to our kind of season structure to change that, because hunters have preferably or historically preferred that higher success type hunt. Of course, with that high population, we do have a lot of conflicts with bear. So our bear program is broken down into basically two different components. One is the agricultural damage, and the other side is nuisance management. And it's basically exactly what it entails. Agricultural damage is your apiaries, your typical row crops, your livestock, where nuisance management is more the home issues, bird feeders, stuff like that. In Wisconsin, we're really fortunate as far as wildlife damage programs are concerned across the nation. We have excellent partners. We have USDA Wildlife Services, UW Extension that are great cooperators for us. We also have a state legislature and state leadership that are committed to assisting farmers that are having problems or anyone having problems with wildlife issues. In the state, we have the Wildlife Damage Abatement and Claims Program, which originally started in 1931. The current structure of our program was actually created in 1983, though. So we've had that program in place for quite a while now, and it's funded through hunting license sales. It's a $2 surcharge on each hunting license and a $4 surcharge on each patron's license. And then our program also receives revenue from the sale of antlerless deer carcass tags. Those are the tags that are $12 for residents, $20 for non-residents. That revenue outside the chronic wasting disease areas goes into our program. Within the chronic wasting disease areas, we get $7 from each of those tags. That goes to our program. By state statute, it's a state program, but it has to be administered through the participating or through counties. Basically, all counties participate except for Kenosha and Menominee counties. All the other counties do. The counties in blue color there, those are counties that choose the contract with USDA Wildlife Services. So USDA Wildlife Services implements the program in those counties. And then in the white counties, green, red, and purple, those are counties that either have an independent damage technician implement the program or they have a county employee administer the program there. So you can see it. Wildlife Services does, right now they administer the program in 52 counties, and then independent counties, we call them, are 18 independent counties. So under the program, the species that are eligible are deer, bear, turkey, elk, geese, and a couple years ago, cougar were added to that program. We have not had any verified cougar depredations in the state, but the legislature a few years ago wanted to be proactive. As you're all aware, there's sightings of cougars, and they periodically come through the state, and the legislators wanted to have some type of a compensation program available if depredations became an issue. So cougars are included under the program, but we have not had any conflicts with them. Incidentally, sandhill cranes are also in state statute as being covered under the program, but not until there's a hunting season for sandhill cranes. The type of crops that are covered is also in state statute, and it's your standard row crops, your corn, soybeans, alfalfa, that stuff. Truck crops, so the gardens that are out there that may sell produce at farmers markets or along the roadside, those are eligible. Stored crops, silage bags, we do have a fair number of silage bag issues each year from bear. Stored feed, so that's eligible. Orchards, Christmas trees, nursery stock, apiaries, a lot of issues with bear and apiaries around the state, and then of course livestock is also included under the program. So to enroll in the program, basically the county has to participate. Most of them do. Like I said, damage must be from one of those eligible species, and then typically with livestock this doesn't apply, but for the typical row crops is that the damage specialist has to be notified within 14 days of damage occurring. And obviously that's so we can get abatement out there and try to prevent or reduce the amount of damage that's occurring. So that 14-day requirement is in place. And then also, because this program is funded through hunting license sales, the enrollee must control hunting access on that property. One of the requirements for enrolling in this property is that public hunting access is required on the property. Like I said, it's funded through hunting license sales, so the state legislature, when they created the program, thought hunters should have access to assist with the species that's causing damage on those properties. So if you're enrolled for bear damage, you have to allow public hunting access for bear. You don't have to allow it for deer or any other species. If you're enrolled in the program for deer damage, you would have to allow public hunting access for deer. There are a couple exceptions where that doesn't apply to deer, but in most cases hunting is required on those properties. And there's no fee for enrolling in the program. It's a voluntary enrollment. There's no fee for enrolling in the program, but there is that public hunting access requirement. So bear enrollments, as you can see, it's in general on the increase. Last year, 290 individual farmers enrolled for bear damage. And that could be standard row crops. A lot of our bear damage issues are corn in the milk stage when the bears are hitting them. But we do have a fairly significant number of apiary owners that also enroll in our program to receive some assistance. So basically, damage occurs, you contact the county damage specialist, you enroll in the program. The next step would be determining what abatement is best. For bear, whether it's agricultural damage or nuisance situations, our primary abatement method is trapping and relocating the bear. Bear are relocated a minimum of 25 miles and onto contiguous large tracts of land under public ownership. So whether it's county, state, or national forest, that's where the bears are relocated. They're not relocated to any private properties. Last year in 2015, for agricultural conflicts, you can see 365 bear were relocated. So a number of bear are being moved around the state, and the reason, it's not probably the most cost-effective option, but hunters in our state, have preferred that these bear be relocated rather than shooting permits or some other type of lethal control, because they want the hunting opportunity for the bear. If you're waiting anywhere from 1 to 9 years for a hunting permit, a bear hunting permit, you want the opportunity to harvest those animals rather than someone harvesting them with no preference or very little interest in bear hunting. So trapping and relocation has been the primarily the most accepted abatement that we've implemented. We do, as a last resort, get the bear shooting permits. You can see last year we had 30 bear shooting permits, 65 bear harvested on shooting permits. One note I will make is that in the situations with livestock depredations, our response with livestock depredations is a lethal response. Either we attempt to trap and euthanize that bear, or we issue a permit to the landowner to shoot and remove that bear. History, it's livestock depredation is kind of learned behavior, and what we found is typically once a bear depredates, it's likely to depredate again. So our response, for depredating bears is in most cases is a lethal lethal control for that. Like I mentioned, we do have a lot of apiary issues and some silage bag issues. So temporary fencing is probably our probably the second most abatement that we use, and it's just putting up electric fencing around those structures to protect them. It works extremely well. I wish I had an accurate count of how many apiaries. I bet you we probably have 200, 250 apiaries around the state fenced, with temporary fencing like this to protect from bears. So it's another abatement method that we use pretty commonly. So claims, obviously a part of this program is to provide that abatement assistance, but then also compensation for those damages. For the standard row crops, livestock, those prices are set by the county. Typically, the county damage specialist will talk with seed dealers, feed stores, UW Extension, and they'll come up with a price each year for those crops. The enrollees must comply with any abatement measures. If we issue a deer shooting permit, those individuals have to shoot a certain number of deer on those permits to be eligible for compensation. You have to be in compliance with normal agricultural practices. So that means, if a crop's left over winter, that's typically not a standard agricultural practice. So compensation would not be provided in those situations. So those factors are taken into consideration, and then also, if they do meet all those requirements, the county submits a claim to the DNR by March 31st, and then the department has until June 1 to pay those claims. So a couple weeks ago, I just finished paying, I think, 270 claims from the 2015 season. So we just kind of completed that process. The payment amounts are in state statute. Like I said, the county set the price for per bushel or the price for that commodity. But then there are also further restrictions placed in state statute. So for each claim, there's a $500 deductible. And then beyond that, we reimburse 100% up to $5,000 or $5,500 with that deductible in there. And then beyond that, 80% we will compensate for up to a maximum of $10,000.
What's your definition of crop?
Crop would be, it's any standard agricultural row crop, livestock, Christmas trees, nursery stock. One of those slides I had before had that whole definition of what is covered under the program. So all that stuff is eligible for the program, and the county damage technician, when they go out to enroll people, they verify that it's an eligible crop type before they enroll. So things like food plots, obviously that wouldn't be eligible. Someone's personal garden, if they have a garden out there and the crops are used for personal consumption or family consumption, that would not be eligible under this program.
But livestock would be.
Livestock is, yep, correct. And again, that's just for bear or cougar damage under the aspects of this program. This was changed 2009. The state legislature changed these. In 2009, we were projecting a shortfall within the program. So in 2009, the state legislature made some changes. Prior to that, it was a $250 deductible and a $15,000 maximum claim. So, those were decreased a little bit to make up for that projected shortfall. Just want to mention nuisance bear management. We contract with USD Wildlife Services, or the DNR contracts with USD Wildlife Services to handle all their nuisance bear conflicts. And, there's a number of them out there. Wildlife Services responds, anywhere from 800, I think, to as many as 1,500 complaints each year about bear. Obviously, the nuisance stuff is separate from the agricultural damage, but I just want to make people aware that, even if, you're not having problems with livestock, if you are having problems with aggressive bear or, other issues that are non-agricultural, there is assistance available through USDA Wildlife Services. Interestingly enough, probably 70% of those nuisance calls that we get every year can be solved with technical assistance, which is in many cases removing the attractant, whether it's a bird feed or a garbage can or a grill, something like that. So a lot of times there's some attractant that's involved, but nonetheless, there is assistance available for just a general homeowner or someone else that's dealing with nuisance bear issues. Kind of jump into wolf management here. So, wolves were in the state, as early as 1950 and earlier. There was a bounty in place on wolves that went through 1957, which, through extensive removal and pressure on it led to the population decline and eventual elimination of the wolves. By 1960, there was no known wolves in Wisconsin. There was a remaining population in northern Minnesota and Ontario. And it was through that population there and through the protections put in place through the Endangered Species Act during the 1970s that allowed that population to naturally expand and move southward into the state again. Wolves, there's a lot of misconceptions that, state DNR brought wolves back in. That's not the case. Wolves, expanded and recolonized Wisconsin through those remaining packs that were in northern Minnesota and Ontario. So obviously they've expanded in the state and have done quite well. This is our winter pack count and map from the winter of 1979, 1980, 90 to 91. You can see the range and the packs are continuing to grow. 2001 to 2002 winter. Here we are, 2009, 2010. And here's last year's wolf map. So you can see the population through those protections, has done pretty well in Wisconsin. They've colonized majority of the prime wolf habitat in the northern part of the state, then also in the central forest, which is that yellow area that you see in the middle part of the state. So how do we track the wolf population? We have carnivore tracking blocks. So these are approximately 200 square mile areas that we do a variety of survey methods in those areas. Primarily, it's winter track counts is what we use. We have volunteer trackers that are trained throughout the state to, in the wintertime, drive certain transects and look for wolf tracks, and then you follow them and you try to figure out how many wolves are present there. Last year, 2011, 2015 winter, over 16,730 miles were tracked either through DNR trackers or volunteer trackers. So that's primarily the method that we use. Utilize pack counts and then numbers, wolf numbers as well. We also use aerial survey. There's approximately 45 wolves that are collared around the state right now. That number will increase here in the next month or two as we trap and collar additional wolves. But so we have DNR pilots that occasionally fly these packs, locate them. If they can find them, they'll count the number of wolves in them. But then we also have the trackers and volunteers going and kind of ground truth and look for tracks with those same packs. So those are primarily the two type of methods that we use for estimating the population. We also do solicit or encourage people to report wolf sightings and presence of wolves to us on our DNR's website. There's a spot there where individuals can report sightings to us, and oftentimes if you have pictures, provide pictures to us so we can verify, and we'll have a local DNR biologist try to verify that stuff. So it's a really heavily citizen monitoring type based program, both through the voluntary track studies or surveys, and then also through voluntary reporting to us where they're seeing wolves. As far as management, the state's broken into 6 zones there. Zones 1 and 2 and 5 are primarily dominated by lower density agricultural, lower land use, more forest cover. Zones 3 and 4 have higher density agricultural with mixed forest, and then zone 6 is, as you can imagine, more heavily dominated by agricultural and human use. And of course, our population objectives and when we do have the ability to have hunting seasons, quota levels and stuff like that, play into these zones and the limited land use or land cover there. So the overwinter minimum count, this is from last winter, so it's from 2014-2015 winter, was that there were 746 to 770 wolves in the state with a minimum of 208 packs. Now, one thing I do want to stress here is that this is a minimum. This is the overwinter count. So as when pups are born in spring, this number, is a lot higher. And then that number will decrease throughout the year as mortality events occur, whether it's disease or collisions with cars, stuff like that. But so this is the low number. We do not have last year's figures available yet. My understanding is they will be available in June, and so those will be coming out in June and available to the public next month. So this is kind of the changes in the wolf population. As I showed you in those pack maps, the numbers have substantially increased. Like I said, we're up to 746 plus animals right now. You can see the little decline there when we did have the ability to harvest wolves in 2012, 13, 14. We were putting pressure on those animals and intentionally trying to reduce those numbers. The current state wolf management plan has a goal in there of 350 wolves. I think it's it's been acceptable to the public, or at least through administration, that we need to knock wolf numbers down a little bit, and we were going to gradually do that. But obviously there's some legal issues that came into play for that. But nonetheless, the growing wolf population, and we're anywhere from that 750 up to 800 range, and that is a minimum count again. So the state management actions during 2012 and 14, this graph's a little confusing because this is by wolf year, which is April through April. But you can see there was, as I said, there was deliberate pressure put on wolves to reduce the population, and that occurred through the harvest seasons. You can see there 528 animals were harvested through the state's hunting and trapping season. Agency control, which would be control through USDA Wildlife Services or DNR control at depredation sites. And then landowner control. When wolves are delisted, the state has authority to issue shooting permits to landowners that have had conflicts. And you can see 38 wolves were removed through landowner control. So, nonetheless, when we did have the authority to manage wolves, we were putting pressure on that population to try to control numbers and reduce numbers. Most of you are aware of kind of the seesaw or back and forth that has occurred with the listing of wolves. This is the state kind of history, 1957 when it was first designated as protected animal, listed as endangered in 75, 1999 as threatened, and then as recently as 2012 is when it was actually designated as a state game species. And that was when the federal delisting occurred, and then the DNR also had received management authority to implement a hunting and trapping season and also depredation control. So currently it is still a state game species. On the flip side of things, though, we also have to comply with the federal regulations. And as of December 19, 2014, wolves were placed back on the endangered species list federally. One thing I do want to note is, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Minnesota, it's considered one Great Lakes population of wolves. Unfortunately, in my opinion, for Wisconsin and Michigan, they're endangered species in Wisconsin and Michigan, and they're threatened species in Minnesota. And for damage management, what the difference is there is that Minnesota can still implement lethal control at depredation sites because it's a threatened species there, whereas Wisconsin, since it's an endangered species, we have no lethal control authority right now. The only lethal control authority we have within the state right now is if there's a human health and safety situation. In those cases, we will consult with the Fish and Wildlife Service, and we may implement lethal control. We did that last year at one farm in Price County, and removed one wolf there. But otherwise, the fortunate part is we don't have an integrated damage management program right now. It solely relies on non-lethal control. So the federal listing status, this is just kind of a graph showing you those different time periods of when wolves were listed and not listed. Obviously the purplish there is when wolves were a listed species. The white line there is where wolves first met the criteria for being delisted from the Endangered Species Act. And basically that says that That delisting criteria was basically that 100 or more wolves would be present for at least 5 consecutive years outside of Minnesota. So basically, Wisconsin and Michigan had to have a population of 100 or more wolves, for 5 consecutive years. And, looking at those numbers there, we've certainly met that for quite a while. But nonetheless, they are still federally listed, which does impact our ability to implement control options or even a hunting and trapping season for them. So, there's been a lot of talk last year and this year already about potential ways to get wolves delisted and back into state management. So there's basically 3 options available for that. One is whether or not the Fish and Wildlife Service would initiate a new delisting rule. There has been no talk of that occurring, so I don't know how feasible that would be. The one that has got the most coverage and discussed the most is legislation, within Congress passing some type of legislation to delist wolves. That was attempted last year, and a couple different bills were introduced, but none of them were passed last year. There's talk of another delisting bill being included in the Fish and Wildlife Service's appropriation bill this year. There's talk about it. I don't know if that's going to happen, but that's another potential avenue for delisting to occur. And then the third option is to appeal the court's decision from 2014. That has occurred, or the Fish and Wildlife Service is appealing that. Wisconsin has signed on as a party to that appeal. So that's kind of playing out in the courts, and I don't know the timeline on exactly when briefs need to be filed and when action could take place on that. But those are the 3 options available for hopefully getting wolves delisted and back into state management. So we do have a wolf depredation and compensation program. That program started in 1984. It passed through the budget bill in 1984, and at that point in time, it wasn't specific to wolves. It was specific to all endangered resources. So any animal that was listed under endangered resources program or state listed as an endangered species, we would provide compensation for that. Wolves were, of course, one of those. Another species that we had paid compensation for was osprey at aquaculture facilities. So at that point in time, it wasn't specific to wolves. It had just said endangered or threatened species. In the 1999-2001 state budget bill, though, legislation was added there that said even if wolves are delisted, the state will still provide compensation for wolf depredations. So it wasn't until 2001 where wolves were actually listed separately as having their own compensation program. So that program, was available up until 2004 with pretty wide open. There wasn't any standard rules in place on who, what, when, where, how compensation was provided. 2005, depredations were starting to increase. We're having a lot more conflicts. 2005, actually, administrative rules were actually created that put sideboards on the program as far as what we compensate for, how much we compensate, when, all that good stuff. So, and we're currently, operating under those administrative rules right now. 2011 Act 169, that was the bill where wolves were listed as a state game species, and then that allowed us to have that hunting and trapping season, which, as I just discussed, we currently don't have the option for right now because of federal protections. Program funding, so when wolves are not an endangered or listed species, funding for the wolf depredation program comes from the sale of wolf hunting applications and license sales. Now that wolves are relisted, funding goes back to our endangered resources program that funds those depredation payments. We've also been really fortunate the last 3 years to apply to the Fish and Wildlife Service and get livestock demonstration grant funding. The last 3 years, we've received about $250,000 in compensation or grant funding that we've used directly towards compensation. And then we also received a $17,000 grant to help with some non-lethal abatement techniques or projects. So this is all an administrative rule, like I said now. So compensation under the damage program or under the wolf program, we provide compensation for death or injury to livestock, pets, and hunting dogs. Obviously, hunting dogs that are not actively engaged in the pursuit of wolves, when we do have a season. Rules require that individuals must contact DNR, or in most cases, it's USDA Wildlife Services. We partner with them to handle conflict investigation, but they must contact Wildlife Services within 24 hours of that depredation occurring. Wildlife Services will go out there and they need to find sufficient evidence to classify that as a confirmed or probable wolf depredation to be eligible for compensation. And then once that depredation is verified, the claimant has 14 days to file a claim with the Department for compensation. The only other real requirement there is that claimants have to be compliant with state statute carcass disposal requirements. And we had kind of talked about those requirements a little bit before, and basically my understanding is that from December to March, basically that carcass has to be removed or buried within 48 hours. Any point outside that time frame, that carcass has to be buried or disposed of within 24 hours. So to be eligible for compensation, producers have to be eligible or in compliance with that requirement as well. As I said, we contract with USDA Wildlife Services to handle our depredation investigations. So, you suspect a depredation occurs, call USDA Wildlife Services as soon as possible so we can get them out there and take a look at the evidence and verify or confirm that depredation. USDA Wildlife Services last year responded to 163 reported complaints, with 91 of those being verified as being caused by wolves. One of the things I do want to touch on is the compensation limits. Administrative rule has language in there for compensation limits. So for livestock, compensation limits, particularly for dairy and beef cattle, are set by a panel of 3 experts each year. One person from UW Extension, one person from the Farm Bureau, and one person from Department of Ag. They meet every year and they set the compensation limits for livestock. There is no, unlike the damage program, there is no deductible, there is no maximum compensation limits, any of that. There's that compensation limit per animal, and then also that requirement that it's verified. So if, a producer could get compensated for, 30 animals as long as each of those depredations were verified. Hunting dogs and pets, there's a $2,500 limit on the compensation that we'll provide for each individual hunting dog or pet. And again, that's an administrative rule as well. We also, unlike a lot of other states that compensate for wolf depredations, we also have a missing calf compensation rule, where we will compensate for missing calves, exactly what it says. So if a farmer has a verified depredation, they're basically eligible to claim any missing livestock. And there's a fair amount of literature out there that shows that you can detect some depredations, but especially for calves or smaller livestock, you're not going to detect all of them, and that wolf may drag that carcass away. So that's why we have this rule in place. And it's I don't know the total number of missing calves that we provided compensation for. I could look that up, but I know it's over $600,000 in missing livestock compensation that we've provided since 1984. So we do have that policy in place. We do, we do apply a 2.3% natural mortality factor to those missing calf claims. Literature shows that, roughly 2.3% of that herd is going to be lost from natural causes and may not be attributed to depredation. So we do apply that. The other thing I do want to mention is that we did, in 2013 was the first year it was implemented, but we did implement a 5-for-1 rule, which says that, which limited the amount of claims or calves an individual could claim. And what that said is that we would compensate for up to 5 missing calves for each verified depredation. So that just put a limit on the number of calves that an individual could claim. And the primary, we worked with the Cattlemen's Association to implement that, and the primary reason for that was to make sure producers were actively contacting the department or Wildlife Services so we could, 1, document the mortality out there, but 2, get abatement assistance to that individual to reduce those losses. So this is the kind of the recent history of depredation compensation. This is by calendar year. You can see last year a little over $200,000 is what the department paid in wolf depredation compensation. You compare that to some of the other species that we provide compensation for, and you can see it kind of fits right in there with bear and geese and those species. By far, we have a lot more, or compensating a lot more for deer damage out there than we are those other species. So the take-home message, I guess, when you come out of here, the take-home message here is if you're having a conflict with bear, if you're having a conflict with wolves, contact USD Wildlife Services. They're going to be the initial step as far as receiving abatement assistance and also being eligible for compensation. So, if you are having any problems, make sure you have their number or look on our DNR's website so you can get their number. The other one thing I just want to mention is coyotes. There's a number of coyote depredations that occur every year around the state from livestock. There's no compensation program for coyote depredations. The one fortunate side of the rules and regulations for state management of coyotes is that landowners can remove coyotes year-round without any license requirements. So there's a lot more control authority if individual producers are having problems with coyotes, but there's no compensation available for coyotes. With that, I'll take any questions you might have.